am from a town in the northeast of England called Jarrow, about 8 miles downriver from Newcastle upon Tyne. And to be honest, it's not the nicest town in the world. It's a bit rough in parts. If Sam pops up a picture of the outside of Jarrow metro station, I had a fight there once when I was about 17. But apart from that, it has a very proud history. It was the home of the venerable Saint Bede, a man known as the father of English history. It was also the site of a Viking invasion in 794 AD, and also it spawned the famous Jarrow March in 1936, where a whole fleet of the townspeople marched down to London to protest a lack of job opportunities in the local area. And one or two famous figures also grew up in the town. Sir Patrick Stewart is said to have spent part of his childhood there, as did Steve Cram, the Olympic middle distance runner who went to school with my parents. But one member of the town is a man named Alan Price. He was in the same class at school as my grandmother, and he was also the keyboard player in the band The Animals. The Animals, of course, are most famous. They wrote their names in rock history with their version of the American folk song The House of the Rising Sun. And we all know how those famous lyrics go. There is a house in New Orleans they call the Smoothie King Center. Let's talk about NXT TakeOver New Orleans. I can't believe I did that whole intro just for that. But let's first fast forward a few years from that fateful night in the Smoothie King Center and talk about NXT currently. It's lost a bit of its sparkle, hasn't it? After a few years of providing us with arguably the best wrestling product in the entire world, it has fallen somewhat from those incredible heights. And there are many potential reasons for this, one being the pandemic, of course. Some people are blaming the rise of AEW, some people are blaming the push to 2 hours instead of 1, which kind of compromised the product's signature shorter style. But there is one big positive for NXT, and that is the fact that their big takeover shows usually still deliver. I mean, just look at the card for next week's NXT TakeOver Stand and Deliver doubleheader, which is just chock full of matches that promise at least to be amazing. But if we're still coming down from NXT's incredible peak, then where exactly was that peak? Well, for my money, it was the very topic of this video. So let's break it down into 5 key reasons why NXT TakeOver New Orleans is one of the greatest wrestling shows of all time. Our first reason is something partly outside of NXT's control, but certainly something that can affect the quality of any wrestling show, and it's context. So let's set the scene a little bit and find out about the world in which this New Orleans show took place. By 2018, NXT had already built this reputation as the most spectacular part of WWE's overall product at the time. I mean, it was churning out these incredible takeover shows in places like Brooklyn, Dallas, Toronto, Chicago. All of those shows stand up as some of the best takeovers ever. But again, for my money, not the best. We had some amazing moments and feuds as well, like Bayley versus Sasha Banks, of course, DIY versus The Revival, Sami Zayn versus Shinsuke Nakamura, and Asuka's amazing women's title reign. But there was a real sense at the time that the bubble hadn't yet burst, and we were just coasting along, just enjoying amazing takeover after amazing takeover, and we didn't really know where it was all going to explode, but everything seemed to be heading to a big climax at WrestleMania weekend 2018. So that's a beneficial piece of context in one sense, which really helped the show out. The fact that it really had momentum on its side and that NXT was just riding this absolute wave of positivity. But on the other hand, you've also got to take WrestleMania into account, because there was always going to be the risk that the showcase of the Immortals was going to overshadow the show the night before. And somewhat fortunately for NXT, WrestleMania 34 was not built as one of the best WrestleManias of all time. It was chock full of massive moments, but there was nothing really on the card that made people sit up and say, wow, this is going to be an all-time great WrestleMania. So that probably benefited TakeOver New Orleans in a strange sort of way. I mean, like most modern WrestleManias, it wasn't a show built for the hardcore fans. It featured big matches like AJ Styles versus Shinsuke Nakamura and Charlotte Flair versus Asuka, but on the other hand, it was more centered around, as I say, these moments. Ronda Rousey's appearance, Daniel Bryan's big return, but he was teaming with Shane McMahon, and the main event, Roman Reigns versus Brock Lesnar again, which wasn't received very well ultimately. And this really set up NXT in a very advantageous position. You go on the Sunday night to WrestleMania for the fireworks fireworks and the big names and the explosions, but you tune in on Saturday night for the real wrestling. So in a couple of ways, this show took place at the perfect time and in the perfect place for NXT. It was a real convergence of different threads that all led to that point. But that was no guarantee that the show was going to be any good. It still had to deliver, and boy did it. And a big reason for that is our second reason on this video, the build. The build to this takeover was a classic example of NXT's style of storytelling, and by their style of storytelling I mean not too complicated, not overly comedic like the main roster sometimes can be, but you know, very solid, inspired heavily by the past, things like the NWA Mid-Atlantic in the late 80s, but also with a modern edge, comparable in a way, I guess, to New Japan in the 2010s, in that most of the storytelling was actually done in the matches themselves by the actions of the wrestlers, rather than in fairly contrived promo segments and interviews and things like that. And some storylines had a very simple build that you could sum up in just a line or two. The NXT Women's Championship match between Ember Moon and Shayna Baszler, that was a rematch from the previous takeover in Philadelphia, which Ember Moon had won, but Shayna Baszler was obviously on this tear. She looked like a real prospect, and Ember, going into the match, even as champion, was kind of the underdog. And that's pretty much all the story you need to know for that one. The same can be said of the men's NXT Championship match between Andrade and Aleister Black. Andrade was in the absolute form of his life. He just had a 5-star match with Johnny Gargano at TakeOver Philadelphia, retaining the belt, of course, and was now facing a very different prospect in the form of Aleister Black. Again, a very simple story, but one that is still very effective regardless, or perhaps because of that simplicity. Everything's streamlined and there's no extra clutter in the way. The tag team situation was a little bit more complicated because the Authors of Pain and the team of Pete Dunne and Roderick Strong had made the finals of the Dusty Classic that year, but then the Undisputed Era had gotten involved and ruined the finals, so Regal had booked a triple threat, like 3-team rematch, but with the Undisputed Era's belts on the line as well as punishment. A little bit more complicated there, a little bit more convoluted, but at the same time, it's not too outrageous, is it? It's very good stuff. Regal's always an excellent authority figure when he gets involved, and the bulk of the storytelling in this match would actually come right at the end, at the event itself, so we'll get to that later on. There was also a fair bit of uniqueness on this card, specifically in the match for the North American Championship, a brand new title which always gets people interested, especially in the first ever match to decide the inaugural champion. And there were a lot of exciting names in this match, but there was a bit of intrigue surrounding it as well, because of course it featured the debuting EC3, who, he's not really a ladder match boy, is he? And that would prove to be the case in the match as well. He didn't win. And then of course it was main evented by that unsanctioned match between Johnny Gargano and Tommaso Ciampa, which I think is one of the best stories NXT has ever told before it kind of lost its way, but that came after this event. This event can really be seen as the pinnacle of that feud. And that all centered, of course, around DIY breaking up, Ciampa turning on Gargano after their loss to the Authors of Pain at NXT TakeOver Chicago, and then Ciampa coming back at the very end of TakeOver Philadelphia to attack Gargano with his crutch, and basically set up a very intense match, possibly the most intense match in NXT history. I'll put it alongside Sasha and Bayley 1 from Brooklyn. But even the most intense and longest running feud in NXT heading into this event in New Orleans was not overly complicated. Gargano and Ciampa, you didn't really need to spend too much time explaining that to somebody who needed to be caught up to speed. This whole build was a real hallmark of NXT's approach to booking, which I've just mentioned, very simplistic, but not necessarily bad because of that. It just kind of focuses everyone in on the action. And before I mentioned a few reasons why NXT possibly fell off a little bit in more modern times, and I think that the biggest reason isn't necessarily the pandemic, and it isn't even necessarily the rise of AEW. I think that move to 2 hours is what's really changed NXT for the worse. I think that has made it a little bit too similar to what we know on the main roster and taken away some of its uniqueness, and also forced NXT to include more filler segments and filler matches, which was never what NXT was about. One of the great strengths of this show, TakeOver New Orleans, is the fact that there is no filler whatsoever. Everything matters and everything fills the time in just the right way. So we've talked about the build, we've talked about the context, we've even talked about the place I grew up for some reason. I still can't work out why I wrote that intro, but all of that will be for nothing if the show's action didn't deliver. And as you've probably guessed by now, even if you haven't seen the show, it delivered in a big way. Number 3 is the quality of the show. It's time to talk about Dave Meltzer. A lot of people will be annoyed about that, but regardless of what you think about the validity or the credence of his star ratings, you have to admit that for a man who's seen so much wrestling over the decades, it's a useful barometer of quality, even if you're only comparing it with other Meltzer matches. It's still quite a nice gauge if you want to know which matches to check out. This show had 2 5-star matches on it, which might not sound too outrageous. It's certainly very impressive and a bit of a rarity, but it becomes even more impressive when you realize how rare that is for a WWE show. Just a few months before at TakeOver Philadelphia, Meltzer had given his first 5-star rating to a WWE match since Money in the Bank 2011, CM Punk versus John Cena. But suddenly, come 2018, he was giving out the 5-star rating once again for Andrade Almas versus Johnny Gargano. And at TakeOver New Orleans, he would give 2 more 5-star ratings, all to the NXT brand, all within a short space of time. And the 2 matches on this show that garnered that 5-star rating were the ladder match, which opened the show, and Gargano Ciampa, which closed it. Both matches are obviously fantastic. I agree personally with Meltzer's ratings in this instance. The ladder match is everything you want from a modern day ladder match. There's big spots, there's rather painful looking moments, and there's a lot of acrobatics from the likes of Ricochet as well. But that's not the only reason it is, in my opinion, a 5-star match. It's also the sense of mystery about it. I think I went into this match having no idea who was going to actually win, and I doubt I'm the only person to say that. In fact, I think a lot of people, and I think I also, picked EC3 for the win, just by sheer virtue of, well, I'm an idiot, and I thought, oh, it's his debut, they'll give him the belt, and then he'll be a megastar in a year or two, which unjustly for EC3 never really did pan out, did it? So no, that's not what happened at all. Instead, what happened was Adam Cole picked up the victory after a remarkable showing from several people in the match, especially Ricochet, but it was Adam Cole who won that belt and became the first ever North American champion, which I don't think a lot of people really saw coming, although a lot of people might now lie and say that they knew it was going to happen all along. And then, of course, the other 5-star match, the show closer, that was many people's match of the year for 2018. And it would have been even more people's match of the year for 2018 if it wasn't for Okada Omega 4 taking place in New Japan a few months later in the summer. If it wasn't for that match, this would have been a rare instance, I think, of just a unanimous or a large majority match of the year candidate. And it was a great match for me in 3 different ways. Mechanically, or fundamentally, it was a great wrestling match. Secondly, it was an amazing no DQ match or unsanctioned match. They used a lot of weapons in creative ways and everything served the story. But that leads me on to the third way it was an amazing match. It was an epic storytelling match. They called back to previous things. The finish was absolutely spectacular, with Gargano breaking Ciampa's crutch and going to use the sharp end of it and being unable to do so, and then sitting side by side with him, a recurring motif in key moments throughout their careers up until this point. It went all the way back to the Cruiserweight Classic, where they clashed in the first round and sat side by side and were basically unable to fully commit to beating each other up, but then they did. And then, I think Gargano won that one. And Gargano won this one as well, because despite being unable to put Ciampa away with the crutch and sitting side by side with him, and they just look at each other like, how has it all come to this? Ciampa, of course, tries to cheap shot Gargano. He's a heel through and through. But Gargano's ready for it this time, avoids the blow, and then uses the knee brace, another recurring motif of their feud up until this point, to apply a modified Gargano escape, force the submission, and pick up what many people, including myself, considered to be a big upset victory. That is because at the time, Gargano had lost his NXT status because of Ciampa, and if he didn't win this match, he'd be gone from the brand. Many people assumed this was a natural storyline way of moving him up to Raw or SmackDown. So the fact that he actually won this match was a huge surprise as well. Many people were in store or expecting a sad ending, and that didn't happen, and the atmosphere would have been absolutely jubilant. I know a few people who were there, I wasn't myself, but they said it was amazing. And then those 2 massive bookends of the show, 2 big 5-star matches to open and close the event, they're backed up by just an incredible supporting cast of matches as well. When the weakest match on your show is generally considered to be either a very good women's title match between Shayna Baszler and Ember Moon, or a very exciting 3-way tag team match with a shocking conclusion, you know that your event is a good one. If that's the lowest level, if that's the baseline for your event, you're doing something right. or your roster are doing something, everyone's doing something right. Great effort, team, NXT. You know, what am I doing? Leave that out, please, Sam. And of course, we have to give a special mention to the NXT title match between Andrade Almas and Aleister Black. Still feels weird saying Almas as a last name for Andrade. That match, I think, had it taken place in the main event of any other takeover, would still be remembered and talked about a lot more. It's just been kind of lost to history because of the Gargano Ciampa match that followed it. But this match was also brilliant. And again, I think my favourite part of this match is the ending. Watch the whole match if you haven't already, of course. It's absolutely fantastic. Almas, as I've mentioned, was in the form of his life at this point, coming off that match at Philadelphia. But in this one, you've got the story of Aleister Black finally turning the tables, finally countering the ace up Almas' sleeve. His manager, Zelina Vega, who had kind of scuppered the chances of a lot of Almas' opponents up until this point. But Aleister Black was ready for her because... well, he knows her quite well, doesn't he? They're married. The joke's about how they're married. Although I don't think they were back then. But, I mean, they probably knew each other. At least acquaintances. Now, I know what you're thinking. Right, we've got to point 3, and I've already talked about how amazing the show was in terms of matches. So what else is there left to say? I'll tell you. Because, like many wrestling shows, it's not all about how good the matches are. Great matches collected together don't necessarily result in an all-time great show, as weird as that sounds. And that's because one of the great open secrets of wrestling booking is that an amazing event is enhanced by the secret ingredient, and our 4th point, variety. And the variety in this show is executed amazingly. Usually great wrestling shows that utilize variety in an effective way often have weak points to the show, because you've got an amazing match and then you've got something a bit comedy to kind of bring everyone's heart rate down, and then another amazing match in a different style to the previous one, and the show kind of goes in these peaks and troughs. What TakeOver New Orleans does is that even its weaker points are still fantastic, and the way that they get away with it is because they don't have a weak match in there. They'll just have matches that are all brilliant in different ways. So you've got the ladder match, which is obvious in how it's brilliant. It's an absolute car crash in the best possible way, harking back to those classic TLC matches from the early 2000s. But then you've got other things, such as the Ember Moon Shayna Baszler match, which is more your down the line, straight up wrestling match, which features, you know, a dominant heel victory. Maybe not dominant, but certainly one that bodes very well for the new champion going forward. So you've got the big title change, you've got a good wrestling match under your belt. Let's move on with the event. What's next? A shocking heel turn. This is another match that's a little bit shorter, like Ember versus Shayna, because not every match on this card could have gone 20 minutes. It would have exhausted everybody. You needed these shorter matches in there to keep, as I mentioned, the variety. This was, again, every match on this card was wonderfully worked, but this one was all about the aftermath and all about the shocking finish. You've got, if you didn't know already, spoiler alert, Roderick Strong joining the Undisputed Era. I'm sorry if you didn't know that. Roderick Strong turns on his partner Pete Dunne and allows the Undisputed Era to win the match. Adam Cole, who pulled double duty, what a performance from him that night, and Kyle O'Reilly. And then after the deed has been done, Roddy seals the deal by grabbing the Undisputed Era armband, putting it on his own arm, and basically joining the group himself. It's his own decision, but they're happy to do it because he's just helped them win the thing. It was a shocking moment, but one that made perfect sense. When Roderick Strong first came to NXT, a lot of people were confused that he was a babyface. He was much more of a natural heel on the indies, and now he'd turned heel and become the best possible version of himself. Slimy, manipulative, and now part of a group of equally slimy, manipulative men. Maybe not Kyle O'Reilly. He's not quite as slimy as the other 3 members, is he? I miss the Undisputed Era already. So you've got that as like the pivot point of the show, the big heel turn right in the middle. Then what follows that? Another excellent wrestling match. This one, Andrade versus Aleister Black, but it's separated from the women's title match by that shorter, more storyline based match in the middle, which is a wonderful example of pacing and ordering of the show. And then everything ends with the big unsanctioned match. And you might be thinking, well, they've just had one epic men's title match. How are they going to follow that with an unsanctioned match, which is also going to go long and which might burn out the crowd? And the answer to that is that it's totally different. Again, variety. Whereas the men's title match is your standard sort of wrestling match, and it's awesome for it. It doesn't have any weapons. It doesn't have any, deep-seated hatred between the 2 competitors. It's a different story from the main event in every way. And finally, the last reason why I believe NXT TakeOver New Orleans to be one of the greatest wrestling shows ever is its legacy. I think it's fair to say, looking back 3 years later, there is a stupid amount of talent on that TakeOver card. But really, who has been allowed to realize their potential from this card? Who has hit that ceiling, that very high ceiling that we expected of them? And realistically, you could argue nobody. Some of these wrestlers are not in WWE anymore. Some went to the main roster and weren't really given the opportunities they deserved and are now back in NXT. And some of them are still in NXT, having never left. And some of them are now on the main roster, but they're friends with a wine specialist, a sommelier. So it's not gone that well on the whole. This show's legacy is not at all what you'd expect it to be. Many people thought this show was going to be an amazing sign of things to come. NXT's legendary breakout event that would solidify it as like the pinnacle of wrestling for many, many years. Of course, that's not what happened. This was not the equivalent of a band's legendary breakout gig. This wasn't the Stone Roses in Blackpool or the Sex Pistols in Manchester. It hasn't gone down in history that way. What it is its own legacy, if that makes sense. Sounds so pretentious in these videos. But I stand by what I say. This show's legacy is its own legacy. This show is amazing because of itself, not because of anything that came after it. And in a way, that is quite sad, isn't it? The fact that this was the peak for many people involved. But in my mind, despite it being quite sad, it's also something that really cements this show's legacy. It's like a perfect moment frozen in time. This event, if you turn it on, you know it's going to blow you away each and every time. In a perfect world, most of the names on this show would go on to achieve incredible things in wrestling. And while that's not been the case for pretty much all of them, at least we can hold on hope that it's going to happen to some of them somewhere down the line. Thank you very much for watching this video. I've been Jack from Cultaholic.com. Do let me know what you think of NXT TakeOver New Orleans in the comments section down below. And stay safe out there, stay positive, and I'll see you very soon.